Many of you know I have been dabbling over the past year or so in ultra running. I don't know if one really dabbles in that or if they just do it. So I guess I'm just doing it. But I've been doing it for a little over a year now. And I've participated in a few different races, and I've learned a lot about myself and about, I think, the world, maybe, by doing this. It's a very humbling experience. If you're an athletic person and you try to do something like this, you'll likely be knocked down a few pegs. And so I've learned a lot about, like I said, just kind of the way people are and like how we're functioning and how we are made and really how the world turns by experiencing this. Last year, I did my first race. My friend Joe, who's in the room, convinced me to do this race called the Grand Traverse from Crested Butte to Aspen over the Elk Mountains. It's a 40-mile race. It takes 3.5 hours to drive around the Elk Mountains, and it takes about 40 miles and many, many hours of running to get up and over the mountains into Aspen. I was really nervous about this race because it was my first one, and I knew that there were a couple time cutoffs, and if you didn't make the time cutoffs, they would send you back to where you started, which is a problem with a point-to-point race because if you get sent back to Crested Butte and the person who drops you off in Crested Butte is already in Aspen, then they have to drive back to Crested Butte to pick you up. That person was my wife, and I didn't want to make her upset, and so I knew that I had to make the cutoffs. So I ran as fast as I possibly could at the beginning to make the 2 time cutoffs, and I made great time, and I was really proud of myself. Thank you. The problem was it wasn't a 20-mile race, it was a 40-mile race. And so by the time I finished 20 miles, I felt pretty good, but by the time I finished 40, I felt absolutely miserable. For the last 20 miles, I suffered mightily. I figured that at the end of that, because of the pain that I was in, the amount of blood that was pooling at the bottom of my feet, the number of toenails that I lost, it was probably time to hang it up. That was like a one-and-done thing for me. No thanks, I'm done. But because we have the ability to forget pain, I mean, think about this is the reason why women have a second child, right? Because we have the ability to sort of forget how things feel, even after you've pushed a human being out of your body, after a few months of healing, and you see how cute this child is, you eventually want to do this again. I decided I would do it again this past summer. And so I decided to start training again. My buddy Joe decided to convince me to sign up for another race. And so in Steamboat a few weeks ago, we did a 50K together. And I had the exact same strategy. Run as hard as I could for 20 miles. And I ended up out front, and I was feeling good, and I was, at the front of the pack, and I was excited about my performance, and at mile 20, I tanked and flamed out hard. And I spent the last 10 miles absolutely miserable. I decided to make some changes. There's this guy named Rob Krar who you probably haven't heard of him. He's a super athlete, but you wouldn't have heard of him because he runs ultra marathons, and people just don't really care about people who run ultra marathons. He won the Leadville 100 this year. So Leadville 100 is a 100-mile foot race. It's called the Race Across the Sky. It's 100 miles that fluctuates somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 feet for the entire time. It's one of the most difficult ultra races in the world. Rob won this year, and he did it in under 16 hours, which means that he ran 70 of the 100 miles in less than 7 minutes each. Raise your hand if you've ever run a sub-7-minute mile. Raise your hand if you've ever run consecutive sub-7-minute miles, even if it's just 2. Awesome. Raise your hand if you've run 70, no one's done this. There's no reason to waste my breath. Nobody has run in this room, I don't think, has run 70 consecutive sub-7-minute miles. It's just an absolute miracle that somebody's even able to do that. He was doing an AMA on Instagram, and someone asked him, well, what's your strategy for these races? He said, well, I break it down into 3 different sections. He said the first third of the race is all about warming up and just kind of like going slow and making sure you don't get hurt, focusing on nutrition and hydration. You're not really pushing it very hard. And then in the second third, the middle third of the race, you sort of like grind it and gut it out. You just lower your head, you get the work done. Because neither the finish line nor the starting line are anywhere in sight in the middle part of an ultra race, and so you're just getting the job done. You're not moving that fast, but you're just kind of making it happen. Oftentimes there's some sort of big mountain or something in the middle of one of those races, and you just have to get it done and conquer it. And then the last third, he said, that's when I compete. That's actually when I turn it on. It's in the last third of the race, when everybody else is exhausted, everybody's tired. That's when I really turn it on. Now, for Rob, he's up front in first place the whole time. That's just how good he is. And so he's not exactly passing a whole bunch of people at the end, but in his mind, if there was someone to pass, that's when he would pass him. And so I signed up for a 55K last weekend in Crested Butte, and I thought, I'm going to try it. I'm going to give that method a whirl because my whole run really hard for 20 miles thing and flame out hard was not a good idea. So I tried this method. I spent 10 miles or so warming up, getting ready, feeling good, making sure I wasn't injured. This big mountain, 12,000 feet we had to climb. In the middle of it was right smack dab in the middle of the race, and I gutted it out for that section. I just kept my head down, and I got the job done. I wasn't fast, but I just did it. And then the last third, I was like, all right, here we go. Rob's advice, we're going to turn it on. And so I decided to run as fast as I could during that section. Now, by that point in the race, I'm 20 or so, 25 miles in. I'm running I'm excited if I can get, my watch shows me I'm just under 10-minute miles because I'm really exhausted at that point. But I'm pushing it as hard as I possibly can. And for the first time in my life, I passed people at the end of the race. I passed 2 people in the last mile. We could hear the cowbells at the finish line, and I passed them. They're walking, and I kind of run by them, and they're kind of confused because nobody passes each other in the last mile. There's no sprint finishes in ultra races. It doesn't happen. And so I was really excited about this. I didn't place or end up on the podium or anything like that. But here's the thing: I wasn't miserable when I finished. That's a huge victory, a very personal victory for me. I wasn't absolutely miserable because I decided to, per Rob's advice, apply power strategically at a calculated time. And in many ways, that's kind of the story of Esther for us. Tonight we're going to be in the book in the character of Esther. We're going to be talking about these things, and she finds a way to strategically apply power at a very calculated time. And it makes all the difference. It made all the difference for me, and it made all the difference for her. Of course, for her, the stakes were much higher because the application of power in her life saved her people, literally saved her people from genocide. Rebellion for her looked like patience, precision, and persistence. Not often words that we ascribe to the word rebellion, but that's what it looked like for her. To get a better idea of this, we're going to turn to Esther chapter 1. I'm going to read most of the first chapter. I'm going to read it in the Message version. I encourage you to take a look at the screen to follow along. Here we go. This is the story of something that happened in the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all. King Xerxes ruled from his royal throne in a palace complex of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The military brass of Persia and Media were there, along with the princes and governors of the provinces. For 6 months, they put on an exhibit of huge wealth of the empire and its stunningly beautiful royal splendors. At the conclusion of the exhibit, the king threw a week-long party for everyone living in Susa, the capital, important and unimportant alike. The party was in the garden courtyard of the king's summer house. Drinks were served in golden chalices, each chalice one of a kind. The royal wine flowed freely, a generous king. The guests could drink as much as they liked, king's orders, with waiters at their elbow to refill their drinks. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti was throwing a separate party for the women inside King Xerxes' royal palace. On the 7th day of the party, the king, high on the wine, ordered the 7 eunuchs who were his personal servants to bring him Queen Vashti, resplendent in her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the guests and the officials. She was extremely good looking. But Queen Vashti refused to come, refused the summons delivered by the eunuchs. The king lost his temper, seething with anger over her insolence. The king called in his counselors, all expert in legal matters. He asked them what legal recourse they had against Queen Vashti for not obeying King Xerxes' summons delivered by the eunuchs. Memucan spoke up in the council of the king and the princes. It's not only the king, Queen Vashti has insulted, it's all of us, leaders and people alike in every last one of King Xerxes' provinces. The word's going to get out. Did you hear the latest about Queen Vashti? King Xerxes ordered her to bring before him and to be brought before him, and she wouldn't do it. When the women hear it, they'll start treating their husbands with contempt. The day the wives of Persian and Mede officials get wind of the queen's insolence, they'll be out of control. Is this what we want? A country of women who do not know their place? Country of angry women who do not know their place. So if the king agrees, let me pronounce a royal ruling and have it recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it cannot be revoked, that Vashti is permanently banned from King Xerxes' presence. And then let the king give her royal position to a woman who knows her place. When the king's ruling becomes public knowledge throughout the kingdom, extensive as it is, every woman, regardless of her social position, will show proper respect to her husband. The king and the princes liked this. The king did what Memucan proposed, and he sent bulletins to every part of the kingdom To each province in its own script, to each people in their own language, every man is master of his own house. Whatever he says goes. This is the word of the Lord. It was barely audible. That's great. Thanks, God. As the story goes on, Xerxes cools off a little bit, and he decides I actually do need a queen. Not only for my own image and my own position, but queens probably at that time led and ruled in a part of the kingdom, and he actually needed a queen to lead in that area. So he decided to host a beauty pageant. He thought the most important thing he could possibly do is have all the women in the kingdom paraded before him, and then he would look at them and decide which was the most beautiful, and he would choose her as his queen. Xerxes was a classy guy, as we can tell. Meanwhile, as this is happening, a man named Mordecai, who's a Jew, the rest of his family has been killed by the Babylonian Empire. He adopts his cousin Esther as his daughter. And he enters her into the beauty pageant to be chosen, hopefully, by King Xerxes. Now, I had a hard time with this at first because I thought to myself, well, how's Mordecai like one of the heroes of the story when he's exploited the beauty of his adopted daughter for the sake of her benefit and maybe his own as well? And as the story began to unfold, it started to make a little bit more sense why he's considered a hero in the story. See, in the beginning of the story, it's easy to assume that King Xerxes is the antagonist. He's the bad guy, right? Because he's sexist and because he's obviously really full of himself and he is really superficial. It's easy to think that he's the bad guy, but as the story unfolds, a new antagonist rises. There's someone else who's actually the bad guy, and we see that Xerxes is really just sort of an aloof henchman in the plans of this other man. This other man, Haman, was different than Xerxes. While Xerxes was sexist, Haman was an elitist. He was a supremacist. He was racist. And he was about as anti-Semitic as they come. And he believed that the Jews, especially, should all bow down to him. And when Mordecai chose not to, when Mordecai rebelled and said, I won't bow down to anyone other than my God, we see not only Mordecai's character, but we see Haman's character as well. Because Haman says, well, all the Jews should die. Every single Jew in the 127 provinces that Xerxes oversaw should die on one particular day. So he sends out a memo similar to the one that Xerxes sent out about wives submitting to their husbands, and he said all the Jews should die on this one day. He wrote it in everybody's language so everybody could understand it. Anybody had permission to kill a Jew on that day to make sure that all of them were wiped out. This is going to happen just like that. And so Mordecai obviously is terrified because he realizes now that not only has his mistake angered somebody and it would affect his life, but it would affect the lives of everybody else in his family. Everyone else who's related to him, every other Jew that he's ever known would be killed on this one day. And so he decides to call in a favor to his asset on the inside. And we see now in his conversation with Esther that he knew that a certain time was coming when Esther would need to wield her power in a particular way. And he says to her, you've been chosen for such a time as this. Not such a time as this, like, hey, this is going to be really great, but such a time as this, like, hey, you're probably going to die, but you've been chosen to die for the sake of your people. And it's when Esther utters her famous words, if I perish, I perish. She goes before King Xerxes and knows that if she goes before him uninvited, that she is likely to be killed. It's punishable by death. But she goes before him anyways and says, I want to make a dinner for you, and I'd like for you to bring Haman along as well. And Xerxes is hospitable towards this, says, great, I'll be there. Haman will be there too. Haman's all full of himself and excited about it. Remember, at this point in the story, nobody knows that Esther's a Jew. And so she has dinner for them, and eventually she confesses to them, both of them, I'm Jewish. And Haman, this man right here, has made a decree that not only all of my people should die, but I should die too. Xerxes is obviously furious because his queen's life is in danger, and he has Haman killed immediately. Now, I've skipped over a whole lot of things in this story. There's all kinds of irony, and there's all kinds of motif, and there's all kinds of plot twists, and there's all kinds of repetition. It's a great story, and you should read it. In fact, I encourage you to read it all the way through, from the beginning to the end in one sitting. The Message is a great version to read it in, but this was a narrative written for us to read from beginning to end all together. It's a beautiful story. It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. I also want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we are only spending 1 week or 2 weeks in Esther. I'm looking back on the series. I look back on every series that we do, and I think about things that we did right, things we did wrong. And one of the things we did wrong in this series is we didn't devote like a month to Esther because it's such a great story. So I'm sorry for that, and you have my word that we'll talk more about Esther as time goes on. But in the meantime, I encourage you to read it yourself. When I read the story of Esther, I think about something that happened to Julie and I a couple of years ago when we started to sense a call to plant a church in and for the city of Inglewood. There were a couple of barriers that were before us that we knew would affect our family. There were the challenges and risks that came along with planting a church, but that was more of a vocational risk that I was taking on. There were also some things that were going to affect our family. The first was the fact that crime in Inglewood is significantly different and much higher than it is in the place that we came from. There's more homicides, there are more home invasions. In fact, recently, this week, there was a home invasion that ended also in arson. Which was sort of a weird turn of events for a home invasion. But that happened just a couple blocks from our house. Just a week ago at the King Supers, a block from here, there was another shooting. These things seem to happen more and more frequently, and that felt like a heavy thing for us to hold. And we knew that we would expose our children potentially to more danger if and when we moved here. Another barrier that we felt like we faced was in the inflated cost of housing. We wanted to buy a house here, and some of you who have moved here recently or you're trying to move here, you know that houses are really expensive here. You know that inventory is low, prices are high, and a lot of these houses tend to be fairly small, which for us was a problem as we're foster parents and we have kids kind of revolving doors sort of coming in and out of our home. We needed to be able to accommodate that, and it was sort of tricky, and we weren't really sure. Are we taking on an unnecessary financial risk by investing in a home here when the market is the way that it is? I don't know if you know this about planting a church, but finances aren't exactly certain. And so we weren't exactly sure if that was the best thing for our family to do. A third barrier that we faced was in form of education. And this one was really personal. This one really hit home because it affected the future of our children. And the place that we came from ranked really high in the state and nationally in terms of education for all the kids in all the schools. Here in Inglewood, however, standardized test scores were kind of low. And we weren't really sure what our kids would experience. Overall, Inglewood schools didn't rank as high as they did in this other place that we lived. And we were worried about that. Is that really our rights to kind of toy with the future of our children? And shouldn't we set them up as best as we possibly can educationally? But we decided to come and do this anyways, and to plant here, and to move here, and to be invested in the schools here. And here's what happened. We decided to start volunteering in the schools and to see things from the inside. We got to know the administration, the teachers, the staff, the principals, the students, the parents, and it wasn't long before we fell in love with the schools here. We fell in love with some of the things that God is doing and some of the things that the school system is doing here in Inglewood for the sake of the kids. In fact, it was right around the time that we planted this church that Bishop Elementary School, just a couple blocks from here, was the school board was talking about moving Bishop south of Hamden. And if you look at our little map over there, you can see, maybe you can see Hamden and maybe you can see Broadway, but Inglewood's kind of divided up into 4 different quadrants. And at one point in time, somebody had, I think, the brilliant idea to put an elementary school right in the middle of each one of those quadrants. So in theory, most of the kids in Inglewood could walk or ride their bike to school. And I think that's a beautiful picture of community. Not to mention the fact that a school being present in the middle of a neighborhood affects that neighborhood positively. Even if it's not really that engaged in the neighborhood, it's just good for the neighborhood for a school to be there. And so when we found out that Bishop was going to move, we weren't happy about that. And so Julie and I were really vocal. Several of you in this church got really vocal about it. We went before the school board. We went to town hall meetings, and we said, I don't know. I don't think this makes much sense. And we're involved. We have students at this school. We're invested in this community. We're going to be here for the long haul. We have built trust with that administration. And the school board went from an almost unanimous vote to move the school to a unanimous vote to keep the school right where it was. And we celebrated that here on our first anniversary by having the school superintendent, Winnie Rubin, and Tina Prang, the president of the school board, right here, standing right where I am, to cheer for them, to thank them, to pray for them. We celebrated that on our first anniversary as a church. And it was just a couple weeks ago they invited me to their office yet again to talk about Amendment 73 and talk about the restructuring of taxes in Colorado that would benefit Inglewood schools and schools statewide. The reason why I was invited back to that meeting and back to that table was because we had built trust with them the first time around. And the reason why we had built trust with them the first time around is because we were willing to work the system from the inside. I've learned a lot by being a part of this community, and I think you have too. And I think one of the things that we've learned together is that you have to play by the rules before you can break them. In order to affect change, we have to do that from the inside. We We have to do it from within a community, within a system, within a group of people, within a place of work, within a neighborhood, within a government. We can stand outside of it all day long and point and say, that's wrong, that's got to change. But when we work our way in there and build trust, and we make changes from the inside, that's effective change. That's lasting change. Esther was literally on the inside. In fact, all throughout the book of Esther, you'll see this play on words where there's a gate, and Mordecai, who represents the powerless people of Israel, is on the outside of the gate. And on the inside of the gate is Esther, who represents a bridge of power between the powerless people and the people with all the power in the world, Haman and Xerxes. She's a bridge between the two. She's a representative of the people on the outside, on the inside. We get to be on the inside in this community. You get to be on the inside in some community that you're in, whether it's in your family or in your neighborhood or in your government or in a group of friends or here in your church. You're on the inside somewhere, and it is from there that you'll affect change. This is the example that Esther presents to us. We found that buying into a system and working on it from the inside was the best way to change it. There's a man named Saul Alinsky who's a community organizer and activist, and he said, true revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, they put on suits, and infiltrate the system from within. So as much as we all want to stick it to the man, right? And we want to say, that's wrong, we're going to protest that, we're going to fight that. That's an injustice, that's an oppression, we're not okay with that. As much as we want to do that, the best way for us to effect change is from the inside. This is what Esther gives us an example. This is what Saul Alinsky has given us in this quote. And I think that in a really honest way, this is exactly what Jesus represented to us in the incarnation. Being made of flesh and blood and moving into the neighborhood, affecting the system from the inside. There's something I want to take you back to in the beginning of the chapter that we read, one of the verses in the first part of this chapter. There's a question that is asked. The question is this: do we really want a country full of angry women who don't know their place? The answer to that question is a resounding yes. Absolutely we do. Absolutely we want a country full of women who are angry and don't know their place. Absolutely, we want a country filled with people who maybe sit on the margins of society, who don't have power in society, who are angry and don't know their place, if you will. This book is filled with wonderful irony. Xerxes, a generous king at the very beginning, shows his true cards. And Esther rebels and fights against that from within, pushes back on the empire by strategically applying power at a calculated time. And it makes all the difference. She does it for the sake of someone else. She does it for the sake of her people. And it leaves us with a question: where are we on the inside? What system are you on the inside of that you can affect with the power that you hold? This whole series on empires has been about power that we hold and power that is held over us. And we hope that you've walked away with a sense of what patience looks like, and a sense of what stewardship looks like, and a sense of what it means to strategically apply power at a calculated time. We want you to think about the power that you have and the power that you have over you differently. We hope that you've gathered that throughout the course of this series.